Hello again. We're recording this podcast right after Europe Future Forum has been concluded. This strategic community event in Warsaw we host every year to discuss the future proofing of European policy making and politics has been organized by Publica Foundation, Visegrad Insight, and it lasted for 3 days from 15th to 17th of September. These dates had quite a lot already in terms of the events, the speed and the intensity of different democratic security and economic security topics. And these were exactly the topics of our discussion. We looked into Central and Eastern Europe, including the prospectus enlargement countries, the context of their democratic and economic security during this forum. And we're bringing to you in subsequent podcast recordings, interviews with some of the most notable speakers and participants of the forum. My name is Wojciech Przybylski.
And I'm Staś Kaleta.
And we're recording this episode on Sunday evening, 21st of September. So if you're listening to it and there were more important events, bear with us, but stay tuned for the special interview with Constanze Stelzenmüller, the director of the Europe program at Brookings Institute, who was one of the highlights and the keynote speaker at the forum.
Welcome to the Visegrad Insight podcast.
We bring you global experts on the future of democracy, security, and economy.
The leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Hosted by editors of Visegrad Insight.
Powered by Publica Foundation from Warsaw, Poland.
But back to the events of last week beyond the forum, before we actually dwell on the reflections that stem from the meeting with the strategic community. I think we had a number of things. The motto of the forum, I opened the gathering with a brief remark that linked to the infamous letter by Donald Trump. Infamous or famous. In fact, it seems very impactful. Donald Trump wrote that he expects more sanctions on Russia, and there we go. We have a 19th sanction package, a bit delayed, but still announced on Friday, coming into force after the countries ratify the sanction package that has been adopted by the European Council. And it seems that Russia is getting hit by also the type of sanctions that Trump has already applied, meaning the secondary sanctions for some of the countries that are trading, like some of the companies, entities in China are targeted by the 19th package, something that Trump expected Europe to do in a way. But as I said at Europe Future Forum, Trump is also putting Europe between China and a hard place. There is not a consensus immediately about the type of action that Europe is expected to do, and I think it's also putting a lot of constraints on political action and limits options in terms, of what we call European sovereignty. So that was, I think, the big context of the whole week. But there were so many other events taking place, and one of them I just wanted to mention also in the context of China was the visit of Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, People's Republic of China, who has been to Warsaw on Monday. And we learned from a number of people at the forum, also junior ministers in the government, how the talks went. The focus and the primary objective was a discussion on economic cooperation, but in the context of global affairs today, economy is not just economy. Economy sets the tone for security arrangements. It is an instrument of political and oftentimes coercive pressure that now Europe learns how to use, but other players like China, US, Russia has been very much excelling, if you can excel in that kind of application of such policies. Stash, what else was there in the context of the week? What set the tone for the political and security developments that were so important for Central Eastern Europe?
Right. So you talked about economic security there, and I think another factor for this was, physical security. With our EFF forum was on the back of the NATO Article 4 triggering by Poland after the Russian drone incursion, and now we've seen that again. So we saw this drone incursion, 3 Russian fighter jets, actually not a drone incursion, 3 Russian fighter jets entering Estonia, violating its airspace, and now we're going to see the consultation that comes out of this. NATO spokespeople have said that the North Atlantic Council, will convene early this week. EU leaders are expected to discuss this on the 1st of October at this meeting in Copenhagen. So we'll see what the collective response will be. But another example. You wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I want to say absolutely. You're right to point out that there is a preparatory process and consultations. But very clearly, there are 3 types of responses to be expected, and is already occurring. One, NATO is strengthening military presence, the simply material presence. Then there is signaling towards Russia of the damage NATO countries and NATO alliance can do to Russia. I mean, I expect something in between the lines, informal communication rather than formal public posturing. But apart from military exercises, this is simply, one of the generals of the American army in Europe mentioned that Kaliningrad Oblast, Kaliningrad region can be simply obliterated in case of Russia tries anything. And that's a powerful signal, and NATO says how much or how little effort it will take to get Kaliningrad out of the map if Russia is indeed pushing the line. But the third and foremost, I think here we're talking about the context of joint action on policy, not policing, but policy. Pardon my Central European accent. Policy that it comes with joint action on economic coercion, against sanctions, looking also into disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in, Wojciech, I mean, there was a very strong response from Baltic and Czech leaders, but also others, where they said, next time this happens, why don't we shoot these jets down? I mean, so again, that kind of rhetoric, but also, the Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna echoing what you just said. This incursion was unprecedentedly brazen, to quote, but also there has to be a swift increase in political and economic pressure. So exactly, as you said, different ways of now tackling this. But you mentioned disinformation there that you wanted to touch on.
No, I think you've been covering that. Of course, in Poland, several drones that were shot down and even more than landed safely, and safely, not harming anyone in particular. They came, and as we wrote, there were just a number of them, but hundreds or thousand-fold more damage was caused by rapid disinformation tactics that has been amplified by Russia, that spread like a storm through the Polish infosphere, and disinformation and the kind of political damage Russia seeks to do to Central Eastern European countries, broadly speaking, to all of Western countries. I mean, they're pretty ambitious, let's say. That's something to bear in mind. I think is a critical week, also because of the elections in Moldova. We had ambassador of Moldova, we had ambassador of Ukraine with us, a number of Ukrainian former government officials and business leaders, and they emphasize how much actually the policy and political process next to security matters for their countries in this context. So what do we know of Moldova after so many high-level visits from Europe?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen throughout basically the last year and a half, because of course we've had important elections and referendums last year in Moldova as well, is, this lots of secret underground networks, Russian funded mostly, trying to interfere in these elections. I mean, I saw an article in the BBC where they had an undercover reporter in one of these networks, which was really interesting. They talked about how, members were asked to find supporters of the pro-Russian opposition in Moldova and secretly record them, to spread fake news online against the ruling PAS, pro-EU party in Moldova, and also even to carry out, a selective poll, quote unquote, which could later be used to suggest, oh, well, this election didn't mean anything because loads of people actually disagreed with it. So incredibly, deep interference in this. What worrying signs. I mean, these elections will be incredibly important for Moldova. We saw last year how close these elections were, especially the referendum to enshrine EU membership in the Moldovan constitution. So we'll see what happens. I mean, currently polls are saying that the pro-EU PAS party would secure the most votes, but without a majority. This is also a dangerous thing because that is how Russia wants to operate, is to try and make these minority governments or coalition governments as weak as possible. We'll see what happens. If you want an example of the threat that Russia poses, this week was also the week that Călin Georgescu was brought to trial on his accusations after his rigged election in Romania last year. So, we'll see what happens on the 28th of September.
Yeah, I think fingers crossed for Moldova, fingers crossed from here, from Poland. Most of European Union countries are also very supportive for the future path for Moldova. It remains to be in the hands of Moldovan public, but it's not just disinformation. I mean, it's a bit of a wobbly concept when we say disinformation. This is not about information as such being spread or not, but this is about false, amplified, and augmented narratives on one hand, but also digitally driven amplification of illegal action on voting, basically voters bribing and organization of voters through applications like sort of Tinder, just with immediate payouts in cryptocurrencies or simply direct payments that we have seen both in Romania and are expected also in Moldova here. And I only hope that with the efforts and cautionary preparations in advance, the scale of that illegitimate action and foreign interference would be limited to a negligible number. But I can imagine also whatever the result will be, that there will be contestation of the result. And I think last but not least, switching back to Central Europe, we have a joint visit to the United Nations General Assembly by President Nawrocki and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski. They're going together this time to the United Nations General Assembly, which is, a step forward, one would think, in comparison to previous month when outright hostility was on display on the menu and but after the drone attack, it was expected that they come together. But as we just learned in the recent days, Mr. Nawrocki supposedly is not inviting Mr. Sikorski on board of his plane. Now, we know, and from our painful Polish experience, that you don't fly key people on the same planes to however important meetings, and I refer here to the tragic crash of the plane when just too many officials were on board of one. It seems you could think there might have been some prudency and there is a communication opportunity, but since we've been talking about this information, there are these lines that we keep tracking, and we hope that will be tuned down of political polarization on the executive level of Polish politics that bring sometimes some uneasiness. But I would say, I don't know how about you, Stash, but I would say it's still a progress when we speak about this trip. And
we can say that together in spirit, and they're traveling together in spirit.
Yeah, we'll see how it comes after, and whatever other interviews will be given as some of the interviews during the past visits to US by both politicians were not so heartwarming, let's say, because they've been using this opportunity to attack each other in various styles, but essentially they had to respond to one another's comments. Let's hope this is more of a message of unity this time around. I think the gravity of security situation is very much felt and expected that there would be a response. But let's now listen to your interview with Constanze Stelzenmüller, and let's see what Constanze thinks about the future of European and transatlantic relations in that context.
Hi, if you're enjoying this episode, why not subscribe to Visegrad Insight? This gives you access to all our latest content online, as well as to our live and online events. You can use our special promo code for Visegrad Insight podcast listeners to get 35% off. Just go to visegradinsight.eu, choose a yearly subscription, and apply code Visegrad35. And now, back to the podcast.
During her State of the European Union speech earlier this month, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called on Europe to fight for its place in the world, warning that battle lines for a new world order based on power are being drawn right now. What is the state of EU and NATO security? Will Germany, long seen as an engine of the EU but struggling for some time now, retake leadership? What do Polish-German relations look like as President Karol Nawrocki makes an official visit to Berlin? To help me talk about all of this is Constanze Stelzenmüller. She's the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Constanze, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for asking me. It's a pleasure to be in Warsaw in beautiful late fall weather.
It's a pleasure to have you. My name is Stash Kaleta. I'm an editor at Visegrad Insight, and I should mention we're recording this on the sidelines of our Europe Future Forum, a gathering of 200 plus thinkers provided by Visegrad Insight and Publica to explore the Polish perspective on key European issues. So, Constanze, I wanted to start with some context. Earlier this month, we saw Russia's drone incursion into Poland and the invocation of NATO Article 4. Prime Minister Donald Tusk said this is the closest Poland has been to open conflict since World War II. On the one hand, I think there was a lot of unity shown in the NATO response. We saw, fighter jets now being sent, or as part of this Eastern Sentry, being provided from Denmark, from France, from Germany, the UK as well, lots of different cooperation. On the other hand, there has been criticism of the NATO response. Why were expensive F-35s used to shoot down cheap drones? These sorts of things. Would you say NATO is ready for this further aggression? And if not, what does it need to do?
So you've just made the point yourself, really. Fighter jets are not a good way to counter drones. And it's been widely noted that of the supposedly 19 drones that entered Polish airspace, 3 were shot down by these fighters, right? That is a cost-benefit ratio that is not just financially unsustainable, it doesn't make sense militarily. And honestly, we've had 3.5 years of watching the Ukrainians engaging in countering Russian drones, and we ought to have factored this into our own defenses, for the past 3 years. So yeah, that is concerning. The scrambling by other alliance partners, allies, to support Poland is good. The fact that we aren't really deploying the right countermeasures is concerning. More generally, I think there is still debate about what the actual purpose of this incursion was, right? The debate has somewhat unhelpfully centered around the question of intent. I think that this is just more of the Russians testing Western unity, Western resolve, and Western countermeasures. We're not in Article 5 territory here, I don't think, right? But I personally think that the Russians must know that anything that really is an Article 5 attack would generate a full-on NATO response, right? The problem is really that the gray zone activities that the Russians have been deploying for the past 3.5 years across Europe have already shown weaknesses in our resilience and our ability to counter those, whether it is propaganda, disinformation, sabotage, or this kind of stuff. And as we have supported Ukraine, as we have been adding to our defense and deterrence in conventional terms, I think we're still showing significant weaknesses in this gray zone area. And that is where, in fact, a great deal of risk lies, because it allows the Russians to exhaust us, right, and test us all the time below the threshold of Article 5. And I think that's something we really need to do something about.
The question that follows on from this, as a German expert that you are, is Germany has traditionally been a kind of leader on this, on security for the EU, but also part of NATO. I was reading your FC column, which I would encourage listeners to read as well, because it's great.
Thank you.
You talk about how to quote, the much vaunted culture of self-restraint has been hard to overcome. Do you see Germany still as a leader in Europe, for good or bad?
So I always get a little anxious when I get asked about German leadership. Not so much for the reason that I would have gotten anxious in my 20s, right, when my reflex was still very much rooted in our history, but because I think that to assume that in this Europe, modern Europe, one nation, even one with as large as an economy, the third largest economy in the world, ought to sort of by rights or naturally be the leader of Europe, I think is genuinely problematic, right? The whole point of the construction of the European Union is to give the smaller and weaker countries an equal voice. And I think if we don't manage collegial leadership in Europe, we have a problem, right? Mm-hmm. That's my counter to this. That said, I think the famous Spider-Man quote is, great power gives great responsibility. And that does mean that we need to take on a larger part of the burden, right? I do think that the current centrist coalition of Chancellor Merz is profoundly serious about gearing up the German defense industrial base and gearing up the armed forces, the Bundeswehr, and German defense spending. All of that is sincere and serious. In practice, as we know, it's genuinely hard to orchestrate, and because it. And then there's always the other question of the fact that things that we do or don't do have an impact beyond our borders, right? Mm-hmm. And that the German-Polish relationship, which I know we'll get to, is famously touchy, right? Yeah. About these questions. I'm actually more worried about Germany's political and economic leadership than I am about the defense. I think the defense, difficult as it is, at least is something where we have all understood the threat, right? That is, I don't think there's any sort of turning back the clock there, right? And the armed forces, while often more bureaucratic than they ought to be, at least know how to get stuff done, right? I'm more worried about the state of the German economy, right? And the fact that we have been protective of certain manufacturing industries, especially the car industry, and that German protectionism has paradoxically led to exposing our industries to very aggressive Chinese trade policy. And we're in the third year of recession, right? And so the economic underpinnings of German power are quite seriously in question. And again, that what we do or don't do in economic policy has repercussions beyond our borders, because especially the German manufacturing and auto industries are so deeply intertwined with Central Eastern European car parts manufacturing. So Poland, I think, has a very intrinsic, and its other neighbors have a very personal and legitimate interest in our not screwing this up. Yeah, to put it unacademically. And then finally, there's the political question of leadership. And you are seeing in Germany a surge of the hard right. The AfD is the most extremist hard right party in Europe. And that surge, I think, is very noticeable right now and de facto limits the political bandwidth that we have for effective and legitimate foreign and security policy. Right? So again, you have an interest and are getting that right too.
Hello again! If you're enjoying this episode, make sure to give us a rating. It really helps boost our platform and invite more guests for you, our listeners.
What about from on the other side of the pond? I mean, we know the transatlantic cooperation is poor. We know that we're in a moment of this paradigm shift. To quote your column again, Trump is overseeing the greatest unfettering of federal executive power in US history while swinging the sledgehammer of geoeconomic coercion against allies and adversaries alike. In that context, how do you see the US as a global leader? I mean, you're based in Washington. What impression do you get?
Well, I'm drawing a deep breath as I sort of sort my thoughts on this. As I was saying in your conference's opening fireside chat last night, this is the third time I'm living in America. I lived there as a child because my father was posted there as a German diplomat. Then I went to graduate school there, and I've been living there, for more than a decade. And so it's a country that I think I know quite well. I wrote my German doctoral thesis about American constitutional law. It's a country that I admire in many ways, and that, where I have sort of considered myself as family. Right, and I've considered America as family, and I have many American friends and had an American godparents. So to live in a moment where an American administration considers the Europeans as unreliable allies, and both in the ideological sense, but also in the military sense, is very concerning. And I've been saying for a long time that Europeans and we Germans need to do much more, that the burden of defending Europe must shift decisively to Europe. But so on that count, to be honest, the Trump administration is correct, but it is correct in the way that the Biden administration, the Obama administration, and others were correct before it. Right. What's disturbing to me is the what I've called the weaponization of European security vulnerabilities in order to force their acquiescence into a reordering of reshaping of the international security order, the trade order, the currency order, all at the same time. And that's what that reference to using geoeconomic coercion was about. And then finally, there is, of course, also the matter of support, increasingly overt support for European hard right parties, including the AfD. So there is sort of three distinct vectors of conflict between this administration and the European security, trade and currency, and finally democracy. And the democratic vector is reinforced by an insistence that the European digital technological order is as it were fundamentally non-aligned with American interests, meaning the interests of the great American technology giants, and that critique being garnished with a critique of Europe suppressing hate speech with this kind of digital services regulations.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in.
Sorry, yes, please.
No, because you phrased this really well last night at this fireside chat, was that the security and economic threats to the EU are massive, but the EU will survive this. But you framed this digital threat from the US, from big tech companies, as more serious.
Let me explain that, perhaps. I think again, because I think we have all understood, because of the fact that that Russia is brutally targeting Ukraine every day now for the past 3.5 years, at the same time waging hybrid war in Europe, we have understood the nature of the security threat and are gearing up our conventional defenses, our intelligence, and our resilience efforts, although, again, there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think that is, if we get our act together, it's feasible for us to shift the burden of defense to Europe. I've called this buying time, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are trying to keep the Trump administration on our side in order to enable a managed transition to European burden bearing, but we all know that that is what the ultimate end state needs to be. That could become tricky for the strategic enablers, where we are, where the lag between American and European capabilities is greatest. And I do not know that we could really replace the American nuclear umbrella. That is perhaps a more specialist discussion, but there I have some sincere doubts. I think it's important for our listeners to understand that it is not necessary for Europe to replicate American superpower capabilities in order to stave off the Russians. There is a misconception out there that unless we become, as it were, a military superpower, we cannot stave off a Russia that is supported by the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the Chinese. That's not necessary. The Russian military machine is not that big. The Russian economic machine is certainly in trouble in many ways. And what we need is credible conventional deterrence and defense, right? And political, societal resilience. And that's achievable, right? We just need to keep our nerves. So that's the first point, security. Second point, economics. In trade and currency, we really are a peer power of the United States in many ways. I think for anybody who understands international trade and monetary economics, we are the obvious geoeconomic partner as a peer power in efforts to counter geoeconomic coercion by China. To deprive yourself as America of Europe as a partner in this context is an act of self-harm. And so there again, I think if we keep our nerves, we can achieve a lot together. And I'm still hoping that there are pragmatic deals to be made. I believe we priced in those 15% tariffs, but for the Trump administration to keep repeating tariff threats, to increase them, makes the whole economic cooperation field much more volatile than it needs to be. And at the same time, we're seeing accommodationist tendencies from Washington with regard to China that ought to be deeply concerning for us. So I'm not saying that our managing these areas of conflict is guaranteed. Right? There are very significant risks. But I think with careful political management, it is doable.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. And last question, Constanze. Thank you so much for your answers so far. Let's return to Germany and regional issues, because as we're speaking, Nawrocki is, I think, traveling or already in Berlin to meet the Prime Minister, Friedrich Merz, but also his counterpart, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And one of the things they're expected to talk about is this issue of reparations that Berlin, quote unquote, owes Warsaw over 1.4 trillion euros, according to the new Polish president. This is something that Polish politicians, especially from the conservative and nationalist factions, have long demanded and has long been a source of antagonism between the two countries. How do you see these relations going in the near future?
Well, as I say, it's complicated. My parents were war children. My father was drafted as a 17-year-old in 1944 from a school that was actually anti-Nazi in Eastern Germany. The teachers disapproved of their being drafted into the anti-aircraft defenses, so they came out to the batteries to continue teaching them.
Wow.
Yeah, and my grandmother, who was a widow, was called by an SS recruiter at her job managing she was a librarian at a chemical factory. And the SS recruiter said, "You have two sons." And she had the presence of mind to say, I'm sorry, sir, they've just signed up for the Navy. And then she called up the school and said, I need to talk to my 2 sons at once, and told them to sign up for the Navy immediately because the SS was looking for them. Right. And why am I telling this story? My father and my 6 years younger mother were old enough to have a very vivid memory of what the Nazis had done, not just to the world and to their neighbors, but also to our own country. And I think nowhere were these depredations graver than in Poland and Western Ukraine. Right? If you see pictures of what the Nazi Air Force did to Warsaw, sorry, I always choke up when I think of that. And I was looking at them. There is a church area when I was walking to dinner last night, with pictures on the fence, photographs from the 1940s of the destroyed Warsaw, and to me that is still what grounds the relationship. Right, the attempt by the Nazis to wipe Warsaw and large parts of Poland from the face of the earth. That is an astounding act of brutality and an astounding war crime. And of course, many of the concentration camps, right, were in this in this region. The Nazis tried to almost completely eradicate Polish Jewry. I mean, it is a heinous heritage. So acknowledging that, I will also say that I have not just often always thought, in fact, my parents would have agreed were they still alive, that we got away quite well in the 1950s with the reparations deals negotiated by the then first Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer. We negotiated with 2 entities, the Jewish Claims Conference, who negotiated on behalf of the European Jews murdered by the Nazis, and then the Soviet Union, which negotiated on behalf of itself and the Warsaw Pact. And that is why Poland, in particular, got very little out of this. And it then took us decades to create this foundation, the Stiftung Erinnerung, Verantwortung, Erinnerung und Zukunft, that was supposed to recompense the survivors of forced labor camps, most of whom were Polish, and by that time very elderly. So yes, I think it is absolutely possible to talk about reparations. And there's one final point. We still have war loot in Germany that the Nazis looted from Poland. And I think, frankly, we should just give that back, full stop, end off, right? That's it. I think attempts have been made, and it's more complicated than you think. That's maybe for another podcast. What I will also say, though, is that 1.4 trillion euros is 1/4 of Germany's current GDP. And between that number and the 100 million offered by the Germans most recently, I think we're going to have to find a number that is acceptable to both sides. And perhaps also we should focus less on numbers and more on the things that we can do together, especially in the field of defense and security. And finally, we should perhaps not forget that we are actually physical neighbors, right? That many of our citizens, yours and my countries, cross the border every day to work in each other's countries, right? And so ultimately, if we want to have a productive, constructive, modern relationship, we ought to find a formula which no doubt should involve the payment of financial reparations, but also should focus on the relationship going forward.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. Constanze, thank you so much for your intelligent and powerful answers.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure, always. And it's lovely to be back in Warsaw.
You're always welcome.
And that's all from this week's episode of the Visegrad Insight podcast, bringing you the leading voices from Central Europe and on Central Europe.
Make sure to subscribe, and we'll be in touch next week.